the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. As we get closer to this election, which everyone seems obsessed with, the issue of race, as always in America, is becoming prominent, perhaps even paramount. According to CNN, Harris still lags behind Biden's 2020 margins amongst black voters. And she believes, or at least CNN believes, that she has room to, quote unquote, grow. Apparently young voters, this is at least according to NPR, are becoming more, quote unquote, conservative than their parents, whatever that means. And more op-eds about the challenges, the plight, the opportunities for African Americans in America today. There was an interesting op-ed in the New York Times this week from Charles Coleman Jr. on black men are waiting for a Democratic Party that delivers for them. Coleman argues that black men today face a unique reality, that things aren't getting better for them. One man who has given a lot of thought to that is our guest today, a very honorable figure, both as an American and as an African American. Tavis Smiley is a very well-known radio personality. He owns a network of stations, KBLA, the largest network of African American owned stations in the United States. And he's the author of many books, including The Covenant with Black America, that came out in 2006. The Covenant with Black America, that 10 years later, that of course came out in 2016, and a third volume in this series, Covenant with Black America, 20 years later, that came out in August of this year. And he is joining us from Leimert Park in Los Angeles. Long introduction, Tavis. Thank you so much for coming onto the show. What do you make of this? You've been through many election cycles. Everyone always says this is the most important election in American history. And this is the election that will be defined by race and by how and who African Americans vote for. Is there something unique about 2024 when it comes to African American participation, or is it just more of the same?
Yes and yes. There is something unique about it, given, of course, that there's an African American woman at the top of the ticket on the Democratic side. So clearly that makes it uniquely different than anything else we've ever experienced. We've never quite had an opportunity to vote for a black woman at this particular level. And yet, in other respects, it's not remarkably different in that Democrats, I think, still continue to take black voters for granted. One could even argue at times they are exploited by the Democratic Party. And Republicans tend to ignore African-American voters largely. Although I would add in this election, certainly black men are being sought after. The Republican Party, Donald Trump in particular, no matter what one thinks of him, is making a strong play for African-American voters, again, specifically African-American men, given the headlines you just shared a moment ago. So there is this contestation, this battle, if you will, Andrew, I think, for black male votes. We'll see how that turns out. But again, it's different because we got a black woman that we can vote for. But again, much of the same, given that so many people still see our system as dysfunctional. It is a broken system. We are still caught up in this corporate, this political duopoly. So as somebody once famously said, the more things change, Andrew, the more they stay the same.
What is it about black men? There seems to be, again, according to the pollsters, sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, but there seems to be a significant difference between black male commitment to Harris and black female commitment. Is that because of her sex, or is there something else going on here?
It's a great question. I had a guest on my program today who was a black pollster who delves in this data all the time. So I can pass on to you, Andrew, what I literally heard today on my show. And it is that when you look at Black male voters, the data confirms that the younger you are, the more inclined you are, the more open you are to voting for Donald Trump. Talking now about Black males. So the younger these Black males are, the more inclined they are to consider Donald Trump. Some of that, this particular poster, Christopher Sebastian, was on our program today. A part of that is, as he opined, he thinks has to do with Donald Trump's bravado, his attitude, his giving people the finger. There's something about that ability to tell people to kiss where the sun don't shine that appeals to these young Black men, right? It kind of reminds me of Tony Montana in the movie Scarface, famously played by Al Pacino. There's something about this, again, this bravado that these younger Black males seem to be, that appeals to them. But the older you are, and I would put the wiser you are as a Black male, the more you understand what's really at stake here. And these older or chronologically gifted Black men seem to understand the existential threat that Donald Trump represents. So that's the short and skinny of it. If the older you are as a Black male, the more inclined you are to consider and to support Kamala Harris. The younger you are, that's where Donald Trump could make some inroads.
What about Trump's own association with race and racism? His stuff on the Central Park Five, the history of his family's racism, his involvement with Charlottesville. I mean, the list is endless. You know it way better than me. Yeah. Are these young Black men simply indifferent to that, ignorant to it, or they don't care?
I think there may be a certain ignorance to it. You have to consider that some of these young boys were not around, weren't even here, certainly hadn't come into any understanding of the body politic, our system, when the Central Park Five ran into the trouble they ran into. So let's be clear. Obama was around 15 years ago. So if you're 15 years or younger, you know who Barack Obama really was. So it's just amazing how fast the time, just keeps on slipping, as the great songwriter said, Andrew, into the future. So I think some of it may be born of ignorance, just not really clear or understanding what the Central Park Five case was all about. They certainly have no idea of Donald Trump's upbringing and the racism that was employed early on in his career, his family's career, his father. Those are racist covenant housing projects that they were behind. So all the stuff you just laid out that I won't repeat. So a lot of it is just, I think they just don't know, they're unaware. But the other part, as I said earlier, and this is hard to explain, that there's an appeal that he has to these young Black men voters because of his being willing to, to tell everybody where to get off. And as a Black man, I understand that. I mean, I think Black men, frankly, are the most maligned group of folk in the history of this country. That's just my own assessment, that we are the most maligned group of folk in the history of this country.
Yeah. So I don't know if you saw that Coleman op-ed, but he pretty much agrees with you.
Yeah. So I think that there's something to being able to, to connect with somebody who tells the system where to get off again. But I also think that that in this election, as the piece you just put up underscores, there are a lot of people who are disaffected, Black men and beyond, who are disaffected and just don't see our system as currently structured as being interested, willing, able, or capable of addressing the concerns that matter to them. So I think a lot of people are just, they see that it's a dysfunctional system, and they don't know that engaging in the process matters at all. And if you've been voting for Democrats for all these years, and your mama voted for a Democrat, and your granddaddy voted for Democrats, and you are still a Black man caught in a situation where your options are still limited, then you're asking yourself, what has the system actually done for me? And in that regard, you can have some serious and earnest conversation about all that the system has not done to address the concerns of Black men.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the CNN analysis of Harris. And again, it's not CNN. Everyone seems to agree, lagging behind Biden's numbers. Is Harris, in her own way, a representative, in your view, of the establishment? She's surrounded with coastal elites. She went to a fancy college, fancy law school. Her sister was at Stanford. Actually, she went to law school with my wife. Her brother-in-law is the general counsel at Uber. Her husband is a distinguished lawyer up the road from you in Los Angeles. Is Harris, in her own way, one of her challenges or problems is that she's too close to the American establishment?
Yep. Well, there's no question that once one rises to the level of U.S. Senator and to the vice presidency, whether one is or is not a part of the establishment, you're going to get framed in that way unless you do something to make sure that people see you differently. So beyond the framing, I think the answer to your question directly is yes. There's no question about the fact that she is a part of the establishment, and in large measure, she has views that are in lockstep with the establishment. The question is whether or not she can appeal to those persons who she needs to appeal to win this, who understand that she can, in fact, be a change maker. I don't necessarily believe that because one is a part of the quote unquote establishment, that you can't also be a change agent. Because you're on the inside doesn't mean that you can't understand the concerns and the plights, the frustrations, the fears, the angst of those on the outside, and use the bully pulpit that you have to make life better for those, again, who have been disavowed, disaffected, and frankly disenfranchised by the system. So the question is, can she make that connection? She certainly is part of the establishment now, but her upbringing was modest. Howard is a great institution, but there are a lot of Black folk in this country who went to Howard, went to other HBCUs. So in some, she's a member of a Baptist church. Many Black folk belong to Baptist churches. She's a member, obviously, of the Divine Nine. I'm a Kappa. She's an AKA. So in so many respects, her life experiences, her journey is not altogether different than many Black folk in this country. So she certainly has that to call upon. The question is whether or not you have been co-opted by the system, whether or not as a part of the establishment you've been corrupted. And if you've been co-opted and been corrupted, then again, not much I think ought to be expected of that person if and when they're running for high office. So I don't know if she can, sell her story effectively. I think there are moments where I think she's approached connecting with everyday people with the telling of her story. But if I had one, complaint about her campaign, the way it's been run, and given the short runway she's had, I think all things considered, she's run a pretty decent campaign. But I don't know that she has, succeeded as wildly as she needs to, as successfully as she needs to, Andrew, when it comes to sharing her story, connecting with everyday people. I think there's a lot of work to be done in that regard in the weeks that we have left.
That's faint praise, damning Tavis. I think a lot of people might agree with you. Yesterday on the show, we had my old friend, Berkeley professor, Arlie Russell Hochschild. I'm sure you're familiar with her work. Her new book, Stolen Pride, Lost Shame and the Rise of the Right, is a book about her experience amongst white radicals, neo-Nazis, conservatives in Kentucky. The shame and anger that she finds there, do you think in some ways it's not that different from the shame and anger that one might find amongst young African Americans in America today?
Hadn't thought about it in that way, but it is a fascinating frame, an interesting parallel, and I think you may be onto something. I'm noodling the question even as I'm answering it. I think you might be onto something. At the end of the day, I think that too many young Black men in this country have never lived in a nation that they believe cares about their humanity and their dignity. And that goes a long way toward people feeling that sort of shame and anger that you referenced a moment ago. Let me put it this way. I remember this from years ago, Andrew. I gave a lecture somewhere many years ago, and I posed this particular question that night. I said to the audience, if I were to ask you, it's a largely Black audience, tell me who you believe in the culture. I'm not talking about your mom and your daddy or your grandparents. Tell me who you believe in the culture loves you enough to die for you. Just give me one or two people who you believe in the culture love you enough to put their life on the line for you. And there was silence in this massive hall with hundreds of folk who turned out to see me on this particular night. I said to the audience then, go back 50 years, go back 75 years, go back 100 years. And if we were to ask that question of a room full, an auditorium full of Black people then, who you believe in the culture loves you enough to die for you, to put their life on the line for you, there'd be a much longer list. Martin King would be on that list. Malcolm X would be on that list. Rosa Parks would be on that list. Don't get me started. I could do this all day long. If you go back 50 years, 100 years, there were Black folk who other Black folk believed, loved them, and cared enough for them and about them to literally put their lives on the line. You ask a young Black person today who loves you enough, who respects your humanity, who revels in your dignity enough to put their life on the line for you, it's a very, very, very difficult question to process, and the answers are nil. I say all that to say that if these young Black men today, young Black folk today, feel that way about the culture, that there aren't folk in Black culture who they believe would put their lives on the line for them, for their best interest, then you can clearly see that with regard to the body politic writ large, they don't have any evidence that this system, as currently structured, cares much about them, their humanity, or their dignity. Does that make sense?
It does. You, as I said, you own a network of African American radio stations, KBLA. Your tagline is unapologetically progressive. You're a man on the left. You're a progressive. Are you a populist? What's your feeling on populism, Tavis? We've done shows on progressive populists like Thomas Frank. I'm sure you're familiar with his work, who's nostalgic for a moment back in the last decade of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th century, where there was a spark of a populist movement which united whites and Blacks. Was that a moment in American history that we should be nostalgic for? And is your progressivism, is it also a kind of populism? And how would you describe your relationship with populism?
Yeah, it's a great question. Let me answer it in three ways. Number one, I think that in many respects, nostalgia can be overrated. Number one, I'll just put it that way. Number two, I always have difficulty with terms because in the world that we live now, these terms are so amorphous. And I think that these terms end up being whatever people define them to be. So I'm not so sure that I'm operating off of a singular definition when it comes to populism. I can tell you what I believe. The third part I can't answer for you. I can tell you what I believe and what I mean when I use the word progressive. So I'm glad you asked the question. And it's very simple for me. Again, I don't get caught up in labels and terminology, although I do believe that words matter, no question about it. But things get twisted. I mean, Donald Trump, one could call an economic populist. One could argue that's how he won the election the first time, his own brand of economic populism. So any term that Donald Trump, that can be used to define Donald Trump is probably not a term that I want used to define me. But I am unapologetically progressive. And by that, I simply mean this, Andrew. Progressivism for me simply means two things, or a few things. One, that everybody is worthy, equally worthy, just because. It's not about where you went to school, how many degrees you have, how much money you make, where you work, what kind of car you drive, what kind of neighborhood you live in, all these ancillary factors that we use to define who's worthy, and who's not worthy in our society. For me, it's not about that. I believe that everybody, every human being is worthy, equally worthy, just because. Everybody's somebody's child. Everybody is somebody's kid. And because of that, we all have the same worth and the same value. Imagine then if we could take that definition, that everybody is worthy just because, and enact that into our policy conversations. If we truly believe that every American, every fellow citizen was equally worthy just because, that means everybody then has a right to an equal high quality education. If we really believe that, then everybody has a right to live in a safe environment, not next to toxic dumps. And where black and brown babies end up more likely to have asthma, et cetera, et cetera. If we truly believe that everybody was worthy, equally worthy, just because, then everybody has access to universal health care. I can do this all day long. I'll stop. You take my point. So the first definition for me of the kind of progressivism I want to advance is that every fellow citizen is equally worthy just because, full stop. Secondly, when I call myself a progressive, I mean to suggest very, very, very simply and unapologetically again, that I want the same thing for everybody else's kids that I want for my own kids. And we talk a good game in this country, but I don't know that we yet live in a nation where people truly want everybody else's kids to have the same access and the same opportunity as their kids. That's why class obviously is such a significant issue in this country and in our politics these days. But that's what progressivism means for me, that I want to advance an agenda. I want to raise issues. I want to advance solutions that will level the playing field for everybody's kids in this country. And every child in this country ought to have access. I'm not judging outcomes, but when it comes to education or any number of other issues, too many of our children in this country don't start at the same starting line. And so, again, it's not about judging outcomes, but for me, that's what I mean when I talk about my brand of progressivism, if that makes sense.
I take your point, Tavis, on nostalgia. But when we look back, your vision, your ideal of this just because everyone has the same starting point, are there moments in the past, FDR perhaps, Lyndon Johnson, JFK, Barack Obama, where that just because was closer than it is in 2024 in America?
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew. I think that if one looks at it historically, FDR certainly made was Herculean effort to try to level that playing field with his New Deal and all those various public works programs that he had. So FDR certainly made a good down payment on that. I think that LBJ initially with his war on poverty, as you may know, I'm a King student. I regard Dr. King as the greatest American this country's ever produced. Of all the books I've written, my favorite book is probably my book, Death of a King, looking at the last year of Dr. King's life. But you can't talk about King without talking about.
Yeah, and that was a 2014 book, Death of a King, the real story.
No, thank you. You can't talk about King without talking about his relationship or lack thereof later, years later with LBJ. They split, of course. King split with LBJ over the war in Vietnam. But he split in part because LBJ had started out promising a war on poverty. And so long as he was focused on that war on poverty, one could argue that LBJ did his part to sort of level that playing field, say nothing of the seminal legislation that he passed and signed, the Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, as we all know. So there were, to your question, Andrew, there were moments, I believe, in the LBJ years where he was making great strides at doing his best to level the playing field. I am not so sure that since the days of LBJ that we've had any president, quite frankly, focused in on the least of these in the way that we should. And for me, and you mentioned, when you put that slide up a moment ago, you saw a book on that slide called The Rich and the Rest of Us, a book that I was honored to write with my friend Cornel West, Dr. Cornel West. He and I did a poverty tour.
That was in 2012.
Yeah, he and I did a poverty tour together in that during the Obama era. We got on a bus and we traveled the country. I did a documentary series about poverty in this country. And to my mind and to Dr. West's mind, you can't talk about poverty without also talking about income inequality and economic immobility. Those three things have to be talked about at the same time. And I'm not sure we've had any president since LBJ who talked about poverty, income inequality, and economic immobility. My dear friend, Bishop Barber, William Barber, who is the person I think most responsible for picking up the baton that King had to lay down when it comes to organizing poor people. He's made the point any number of times in this election season, people don't want to hear it, that if you could organize the poor, if you could simply find a way to organize the poor in this country, that would save the day. Everybody's talking about these swing states and how tight these margins are. Indeed, they are. But imagine in those swing states and beyond, if Democrats, for example, ever got serious about organizing the poor, that would be your margin of victory, just organizing the least among us in this country. So to your question, there are presidents, FDR and LBJ, we just talked about, who've made some great strides in that regard, but not since LBJ, frankly, have we had any president. They love talking about the middle class, which is evaporating and vanishing in front of our eyes, but nobody wants to talk about the poor, these low-wage workers, the working class. It's just a conversation that we're really not prepared to have as yet in this country.
Yeah, in that sense, of course, I think you echo what Thomas Frank, as a populist, talks about, the unity of class. It goes without saying, I'm guessing you're no great fan of Ronald Reagan, certainly Richard Nixon, the Bushes, and certainly not Trump. But I wonder, as a progressive, whether you have a particular disappointment with some of the Democratic, some of the Democratic presidents, particularly perhaps Bill Clinton.
Yeah, it's a great question. Clinton is a personal friend of mine. I've been fortunate in my career that most of these presidents I've interviewed any number of times, and I call many of them personal friends. Having said that, sometimes I believe, Andrew, that you do have to fight with your friends. They're friends, but you got to fight with them on certain things. You have to hold your friends accountable, and I believe there's honor in accountability. So just to walk through 2 or 3 Democrats, since you went there were huge mistakes that Bill Clinton made for all that he did to stabilize our economy, and the data speaks for itself. The economy was rolling along quite nicely during the Clinton years, but he did a disservice on a number of fronts, and I love this guy. But he was wrong on Rwanda. He will tell you, if he were here right now, he'd tell you one of the biggest mistakes he made was not going into Rwanda when those Hutus and Tutsis were going at it. He could have done some great work there for humanity, but he sat on his hands in that crisis, made a huge mistake there. Bill Clinton has apologized publicly a couple of times, I think, for his crime bill. It was a racist crime bill when he signed it. You had to get caught with 100 times more powder cocaine than crack cocaine for the same sentence. We all know that cocaine was used in the suites. Crack is used in the streets. It was a racist policy, that crime bill was, when he signed it. I could go on, but there are other mistakes that Bill Clinton made as president. Again, to quote my friend Jesse Jackson, these persons are public servants, not perfect servants. So Bill Clinton clearly made some mistakes, say nothing of moving the Democratic Party to the center with that DLC, the Democratic Leadership Conference back then. Big mistake. And he was wrong on welfare. There were, Marion Wright Edelman, the great founder of the Children's Defense Fund, was very close to the Clintons, but they fell out over Clinton signing that welfare reform bill. We called it a welfare deform bill. Marion Wright Edelman's husband, Peter Edelman, resigned the Clinton administration over that issue. So clearly there was damage done in the Clinton era, and our prisons filled up so swiftly with Black men because of that racist crime bill. Bill Clinton was wrong about that. You fast forward to Barack Obama, and the reality is that even after the Obama era, and there were those, as you recall, Andrew, who suggested that his election would usher us into a post-racial America. That didn't happen. But Black people in particular still lag far behind in every single leading economic indicator category. Things did not get better for Black people during the Obama era. It's just a fact. You fast forward then to Joe Biden, and Obama did some good things. I mean, on balance, Obamacare is better than no health care, but in many respects, it's nowhere near what he promised, which was universal health care. It's not what it is. And Rahm Emanuel, as his chief of staff, I think negotiated against their own best interest to just get some points on the board. And Obamacare could have been a lot stronger. And as you recall, they almost abandoned it. It was Nancy Pelosi, then the speaker, who had to go to the White House and basically cuss them out and tell them, oh, no. I've worked way too hard to wrangle these votes. And we are going to have a vote on health care if no Republican comes with us. And as you recall, no Republican did, but Nancy Pelosi is the one we should thank for not letting that fight die as the Obama administration was really negotiating against itself. But Joe Biden, finally, our current president, has been great on symbolism, specifically for African-American people. The symbolism has been amazing. But we've been wanting to some degree on the substance. It's hard to argue with a Black defense secretary, a Black UN ambassador, a Black vice president, a Black woman on the Fed, a Black one on the U.S. Supreme Court. All that stuff matters. Don't get me wrong. Symbolism matters, but substance matters more. And so in many respects, Joe Biden has not been nearly as progressive as many of us would have hoped or wanted him to be. So again, even with Democratic presidents, that's why you have to hold people accountable, because left to their own devices, they end up being garden variety politicians and not statesmen.
Tavis, we've talked about the fate of black men in America, and you've suggested that things haven't changed dramatically. We have a black woman now running for president. I know this is a hard generalization, or this is a generalization which would be slightly absurd, but in overall terms, you're a man who's been watching America now for many years. Has the experience of black male America and black female America, are they different?
That's a hard question. That's a good question. It's a hard question. I don't know that I'm qualified to.
Well, you're as qualified as anyone.
Yeah, I think that black men have suffered to some degree, in part because there are forces outside of the black community who have used any number of opportunities, to pit black men against black women. Here's what I mean by that. In this era of affirmative action, which now has been wiped out by the U.S. Supreme Court, in this era of DE&I, which is now being pushed back upon by forces on the right, there is this terminology that you're familiar with called a twofer. And so in corporate spaces and hiring, if you hire a black woman, you get a twofer. You've hired an African-American and you've hired a woman. And there's a great deal of data I've looked at over the years that suggests that because companies could get away with checking off that box, and when you check that one box, you're checking off two boxes. I said an African American and a woman. That black men, when pitted against black women, black men have tended to suffer, and I think there is to some degree some animosity that some black men have about being pitted against black women and losing in many respects to black women. I don't want to overstate it. And again, I don't know that I'm really qualified to say that, to go deep into the differences in our experiences. What I will say is that, again, black people writ large still lag behind in every leading economic indicator category. And so at the end of the day, I'm not so sure that splitting those hairs, too finely makes a difference overall. Certainly black communities have been hurt. Black families have been hurt with this so-called war on drugs that have taken black men out of the community, and disproportionately black men sit on in these prison cells. In this new book, The Covenant 20 Years Later, we have had to add a section about homelessness. There were originally 10 covenants in the text that came out almost 20 years ago. There were 10 covenants that covered the 10 issues most important to black people with an agenda for how to address those issues. 20 years ago, Andrew, the issue of homelessness was not even on the docket. It wasn't as acute for black America then as it is now. But 20 years later, just imagine in 2 decades, black men in particular have become the face of homelessness in this country. And so there are any number of data points one could look at that suggest that black women have been on the come up in a very real way. But when black men now are the face of homelessness, one can also see that black men have had a difficult road to hoe over these last couple of decades. So again, I don't know that answers your question with any great detail, but that's what I do know at this moment.
You're dancing a little bit on this one.
Just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean,
what? Tell me. Obviously, you have a thought behind that because you posed the question. Tell me what you think what I'm dancing around, and I'll be happy to address it.
Well, whether or not, for example, the idea of twofers, which sounds to me a rather unpleasant idea, is a reality or just a perception. Do you think that a lot of black men, when they apply for a job and they don't get it, and they see that a black woman got it, that their explanation will be, well, white America chose the woman because it's a twofer? Or is it just this broader sense of injustice? Because it sounds, I mean, it's easy for me to say, of course, but it sounds like a black man should still celebrate the appointment of a black woman in a job because it's good. I mean, in terms of righting some of the wrongs of the past.
All I can tell you is this, and so in this regard, I am not dancing. I'm answering as honestly and transparently as I can. Here's what I can tell you: if I took you with me this weekend, this Saturday, to the barbershop, you'd understand more fully how I'm really not dancing on this question. I'm trying to be kind and charitable and generous. I'm not trying to start a civil war inside of black America. Not that I could anyway with my words. But I'm telling you that this is more than just some fanciful notion. It's more than just a conversation about terminology. It's more than just a conversation about semantics. It's real. And if you were in black barbershops, as I am, in other black spaces where black men hang out, cigar bars, whatever, these are very real conversations. And it shows up again in data points here and there. And again, we're family. And you're right. We should essentially all be rooting for anybody. If you're black, you should be rooting for everybody black. And I think generally speaking, that is true. But I'm telling you, not what I heard, but what I know, that there is a rub. There is a rub that some black men feel about the ways in which they believe that black women have been advantaged while black men still suffer in a variety of ways. And that's what those headlines are talking about, those articles you posted up earlier.
Yeah, next time I'm down in LA, Tavis, I'm going to take you up on that offer.
Okay.
To come with you to a black barber store.
Okay.
You've mentioned this Covenant series you've done. You began it in 2006, and 2016, the second edition, and then the third edition, Covenant with Black America 20 years later. You've mentioned the growth of homelessness. What else has changed in the last 20 years?
Yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Certainly the issue of police brutality, police misconduct is as acute now as it ever has been. And in the book on the issue about the covenant about police accountability, I allowed someone to write that essay. There are all new essays in this book 20 years later. The essayist in that chapter, in that covenant, is Dr. Melina Abdullah. She teaches at Cal State LA, and at the moment she happens to be Cornel West running mate as an independent for the White House. But Melina Abdullah was assigned this project before she became a candidate running for vice president. And she and others in the Black Lives Matter movement, and even beyond, as you all know, have raised this issue of defunding the police. People don't like that phrase, defunding the police. Joe Biden took it on in one of his State of the Union addresses and said, no, we will not defund. We will increase funding for police. So even the president of the United States has taken on this notion of defunding the police. And so there are a lot of people who think that notion is not the answer to the prayer, as my grandmother might put it. And I would agree with that. I don't think the answer is necessarily defunding the police. But there is this notion that police have so maimed and so harmed Black communities. There's a conversation about whether or not we really need the police and how we rethink the notion of policing in our communities. So that conversation is as hot as ever. I mentioned already economically, Mark Morial, head of the Urban League, writes the chapter on economics, Black economics. I've already mentioned already that we still lag behind in every leading economic indicator category. On the environment, there's a chapter, of course, one of the 10 covenants about the environment. I'm in the midst of a $2.5 million climate justice campaign, a 12-month campaign here at my local station in LA, where we're trying to raise this issue higher on the agenda for the community, our community, who's most suffering most from these climate catastrophes, these climate maladies. Clearly, things have not gotten better for Black folk when it comes to the environment. They've not gotten better for the country writ large, as evidenced by all these hurricanes and fires, et cetera, et cetera. Global warming, climate change is real. But the victims of these climate maladies happen to be Black people mostly. And so that hasn't changed. So there are a number of things that really have not gotten much better. As I said, a lot of symbolism over the last 20 years. I think if you were to ask Black people in a random poll, survey, or study what they regard as the greatest achievement of Black people in the last 20 years, they'd probably say reflexively the election of Barack Obama. But that's my point, that there's got to be more than symbolism. Now, the way to address, you didn't ask this, let me just jump ahead. The way to address these things that have not changed for Black America in the years to come is to have public policy targeted and directed at the people who most need the help. So if Black people are suffering in these unique ways, if we're disproportionately impacted by all of these tragedies and by all these challenges that our country faces, it seems to me that the answer very simply would be to target public policy proposals at the communities who most need it, and that would be in many respects African American people. The problem with that idea, as good an idea as I think it is when you present an idea like that to Barack Obama and you say, "What's your Black agenda?" Barack Obama shoots back at you right quickly, as he did any number of times, that I'm not the president of Black America. I'm the president of all of America. And I suspect that if Kamala Harris wins, she will say the same thing. I'm not the president of Black America. I'm the president of all of America. And so this notion of how you go about targeting and directing public policy specifically to those persons who most need it is a vexing reality.
I'm surprised, Tavis, that you haven't mentioned Black Lives Matter as an observer, but not an expert in this area. I assume that might have changed something, or are you rather dismissive of the impact of Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I'm not dismissive of it, but I would ask you to give me your list. I don't have one of the things that I think have dramatically changed. Let me be very clear about this. I am grateful for the work of Black Lives Matter. It is the greatest social movement in this country since the Civil Rights Movement, no question about it. I'm grateful for them, as we say in the Black church, holding up the blood-stained banner. I am grateful for their work and their witness. I am grateful for their voice. I'm grateful for a variety of things. But if you ask me to give you a list of all the things I think have changed for the better because of the advocacy of Black Lives Matter, you're gonna be waiting a while on my list. I don't see that list. I'm not blaming them. They've been out there, and I'm glad that they have been there versus not being there. But I can't point to a long list of things that have changed for the better for Black people simply because of the presence of Black Lives Matter.
A couple more questions. You've been very generous with your time, Tavis. I'm going to let you get back to your life. I first actually saw you speak in person at the Braver Angels event in Gettysburg last year. I'm not sure if you remember that. Braver Angels, of course, are a group bent on bringing all Americans, different, whatever their colors, their genders, their sexuality, and particularly their politics, together. You talked earlier about Obama or Harris making it clear that they are or will be president of all Americans. What do you think of groups like Better Angels, who are focused on bringing all Americans together and trying to make Americans as colorblind, as gender blind, as ideology blind as possible? Are they barking up the wrong tree, so to speak, or is there a nobility in their endeavor where some people believe that America is actually teetering on civil war?
I think, to use your phrase, it's a beautiful phrase, Andrew. There is a nobility in their efforts, number one. Number two, I accepted the invitation to speak to the gathering of Braver Angels in Gettysburg a year or so ago because I celebrate their efforts. Thirdly, one of their founders, John Wood Jr.
Yeah, John Wood was on the show. He's a very interesting fellow.
He is, and he hosts a show on this station, my station in LA.
He did?
Every weekend on KBLA. So I know John well. No, I celebrate their efforts, and they are well-meaning people. They're certainly well-meaning people. I just think that the divides, plural, in this country are so deep down right now that I don't know that there's any outsized success, any measurable success that they will have in the short run. And yet what I celebrate is the reality that to move this country forward, we're going to have to find a way. If this democracy, or as I call it, an experiment in democracy, I don't believe we're quite a democracy yet. I believe that we have a Madisonian framework for democracy, but we're not quite there yet. In fact, if we had more time, you and I could debate, maybe not even debate, but perhaps agree that we are an oligarchy or a plutocracy, anything but a democracy. But having said that, if this experiment in democracy is to advance, we cannot stay as divided as we are. So I celebrate anybody who is searching for common ground. I still believe that there are many more things that connect us as Americans than divide us. I'm just not sure how much success they can have in the short run, but I certainly celebrate their outreach and their efforts.
Final question, Tavis. You've talked about changing America, going back to the founding fathers, of course, who built a supposed democracy around slavery. Mm-hmm. Is the only way to really get beyond the issue of race, if that's possible, maybe it isn't possible in America, is to address the issue of reparations? Where do you stand on that when it comes to reparations and slavery, and perhaps even reparations and the Jim Crow America that existed for 70 or 80 years after, or even a century after the end of slavery?
Yep, another amazing question. Let me start with this. racism, I believe, and have said many times, I believe that racism, Andrew, is still the most intractable issue in this country. One could certainly add to that list a number of things: poverty, climate. It seems now there's a long list of issues that may be intractable that we're just not gaining ground on, and maybe they're not all intractable. Maybe it's that these are issues that require more will than skill. I think we have the skill as Americans, we just don't have the will. So maybe they're intractable because we make them intractable, not because they are that inherently. But that being said, I believe that racism is still atop that list of the things that are most intractable, the things that we just cannot seem to wrap our brains around, in part because we don't want to tell the truth, as you did a moment ago, about how this country came to be in the first place. So there's an aversion that we have to just being truth tellers in this democracy. And so the question of the question of whether or not we can ever make progress on the race question, it's still an open question. As you know, there are folk historically who just gave up on America, just didn't think America had the capacity to do it. I'm talking now about W.B. Du Bois. I'm talking now about James Baldwin. I'm talking now about Randall Robinson. There's a long list of folk I could give you who just gave up on America ever being able to truly address that question. I'm not quite there yet, but I won't lie to you. As I get more chronologically gifted, I'm having a harder and harder time believing, Andrew, that we can make progress on this question. Finally, to your issue about reparations, do I support reparations? Absolutely. I still think that we have to define what we mean when we use that term. Again, these words have so many, they're so amorphous in some ways. We need a universal, I think, definition of reparations. We don't have a universal definition of that. You and I both live here in California. The whole nation is watching California to see what we're going to do on the issue of reparations. I can tell you this: I've been very, very, very disappointed in Gavin Newsom on this particular issue. He had an opportunity to do something here in this last session of the California legislature, and he, I think in many ways, punted the ball. One could even argue that Black people were exploited by the Gavin Newsom administration on this particular issue. So right now, I'm very disappointed on what we have done or not done, as it were, when we had the opportunity to do something here in California. What that means for the future, I do not know. My sense is that in the next session, the California legislature will come back in. The California Black Caucus will try to do something in the next session, but I think they hurt themselves, allowed themselves to be played by Gavin Newsom in this particular session, and I'm still licking my wounds over that loss.
Well, Tavis Smiley, my California neighbor, I'm going to come down to LA and accept your invitation to go to a black barbershop.
I'd love it.
Continue the conversation. Real honor to have you on the show. Everyone needs to read the new book, The Covenant with Black America, 20 years later. Thank you so much, Tavis. Keep well, keep safe, and we'll have you back on the show in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity. All the best to you, my friend. Stay strong.